New York City, 1841. The kind of night where gaslight doesn't brighten the street, it just teaches the shadows where to stand. Fog sits low. Wheels hiss over wet stone. Somewhere out there, the river keeps its own time. Dark, patient, and quiet. A young woman works a counter on Broadway, selling cigars to men who pretend they came for tobacco. The city gives her a nickname like it's a compliment, like it's harmless. The beautiful Cigar Girl. Her real name is Mary Cecilia Rogers. And when she disappears, the city doesn't just panic, it watches. This is the story of Mary Rogers, an unsolved case that became something bigger than an investigation. It became a public obsession, a media frenzy, a mystery people treated like entertainment. And in the process, it helped teach America a habit we still have today: how to consume tragedy as a story, and how to confuse attention for justice.
I'm not graphic. I'm not turning Mary into a character. And where the historical record gets messy, where newspapers competed, where accounts conflict, where later retellings amplify rumor, I'll say so plainly. If I describe something as conjecture, that means the evidence is disputed, thin, or coming mostly from sensational reporting rather than stable documentation. Because in this case, confusion isn't an accident. It's part of the legacy.
Mary Rogers lived in New York City in the early 1840s. She worked at a tobacco shop associated with John Anderson, and she became locally famous, if that's the right word, for being noticed, being talked about, being stared at. Not for a performance, not for a book, for existing in public where the public felt entitled to have an opinion. That's the first ingredient in what we now call true crime: familiarity. The more the audience feels like they know a person, the faster a story spreads. And long before social media, newspapers understood that a recognizable name was a kind of glue. Mary became that name. And then, 3 years before her death, the story began its first rehearsal. In October 1838, Mary disappeared, briefly. Newspapers reported it, people speculated. And when she returned, the reporting didn't settle the public down so much as teach it the shape of a mystery. A young woman vanishes, rumors bloom, the city leans in. Then the story snaps shut, for a while. That earlier disappearance matters because it primed the audience. It made Mary a recurring headline, an early kind of case file the public recognized. And once an audience is trained to follow a story, it starts looking for the next episode.
In late July 1841, Mary Rogers tells the people close to her that she's going to visit relatives. She leaves, and she doesn't arrive. If you've ever listened to a modern missing person case, you know the pattern. The last known plan, the last known route, the ordinary detail that becomes a hinge point because it's the last solid thing anyone can hold on to. Then comes the gap. 3 days later, July 28, 1841, Mary Rogers is found in the Hudson River near Hoboken, New Jersey. The river returns her, and the city turns her into a story. This is where the case stops being only an investigation and becomes a national obsession. Newspapers compete for attention. One paper prints a detail, another prints a counter detail. The same event gets described with different emphasis, different certainty, different moral tone. And when facts are incomplete, the empty space gets filled, not with evidence, with narrative.
Here's the grim truth about public obsession. It doesn't wait for confirmation. The audience wants a shape, a villain, a motive, an ending. So the moment Mary is found, the city begins doing what it still does today. People start building theories that feel satisfying. And satisfaction is not the same thing as truth. Some theories are broad, an unknown attacker, a nameless threat. Some are personal, someone close, someone jealous, someone with access. Some are moral, stories that treat the victim's private life like evidence, as if a person's choices can explain someone else's violence. The press didn't just report, it competed, and competition rewards drama. That's not a modern flaw, it's an old one. Weeks later, the story gets a new jolt. Items are reportedly found, clothing and personal effects associated with Mary, adding fuel to the idea that something happened on land before the river carried the outcome. The reporting becomes a serialized engine. New clue, new suspect, new angle, new headline. And now the case isn't only tragedy, it's content.
Let's talk about the theories, but we're going to do it the responsible way, not as a game, not as a vote, and not as a certainty where the record can't support certainty. Because the impact of this case isn't just what happened in Hoboken, it's what happened in the public mind. Theory: a group attack, the faceless city explanation. One line of thinking, common in later retellings and hinted at in period attitudes, casts Mary as a victim of criminals, strangers, a kind of anonymous city violence. It's a theory that matches public fear because it doesn't require proof. It requires only atmosphere, and atmosphere sells. Theory: someone close, the intimate crime explanation. Another line of suspicion tends to circle Mary's relationships, especially her fiancé, Daniel Payne. This pattern is familiar today. When we don't know, we look at the nearest people and ask who benefits, who had access, who seems off. Sometimes that logic is reasonable. Sometimes it becomes a shortcut that turns grief into a target. Conjecture: a clandestine medical procedure. One of the most widely repeated and controversial narratives is that Mary died during a failed clandestine medical procedure and that her death was covered up by disposing of her body. This claim became entangled in public imagination with the era's notorious clandestine medical figure, sometimes named in later discussions. This is conjecture, not because it's impossible in a human sense, but because it becomes a magnet for moral storytelling. In this kind of rumor, the victim's body turns into a canvas where society paints its anxieties about sex, secrecy, shame, and respectability. And that's the part that matters for your documentaries theme. When the public can't solve a crime, it starts solving the victim. It turns biography into evidence. It turns insinuation into participation. That habit is ancient. Mary Rogers' case shows it early and clearly.
Now the story gets darker, because the case doesn't stay contained to one body. In October 1841, Mary's fiancé, Daniel Payne, is found dead near Sybil's Cave in Hoboken. Many accounts describe it as suicide by poison, often laudanum. And whether or not the public had any right to treat his death as proof of anything, it did what audiences do. It assigned meaning. A fiancé dies near the same location associated with Mary. People don't hear grief. They hear guilt, confession, secret, connection. True crime thrives on connections, some real, some forced. And from this moment on, the Mary Rogers case becomes less like an investigation and more like a legend with moving parts. The second death doesn't clarify the first, it multiplies the possibilities. It adds emotional gravity that facts can't easily carry. Noir isn't about darkness. Noir is about inevitability. That feeling that once you step into the wrong night, every road leads to the same place.
A year later, Mary Rogers doesn't just haunt the headlines, she enters literature. Edgar Allan Poe writes The Mystery of Marie Roget, a detective story that relocates the crime to Paris and uses the public record, the newspaper details, the gossip, and the contradictions as raw material for deduction. Here's what makes that important. Poe wasn't just borrowing a tragedy for drama, he was modeling a new role. The detective as reader. The person who believes the case can be solved by assembling public information
comparing accounts, spotting contradictions, and reasoning through it from a distance. If that sounds modern, it should. This is the ancestor of the podcast timeline, the YouTube deep dive, the comment section suspect list, the internet detective convinced the answer is one more thread pull away. Poe's story doesn't hand the world a definitive solution, but it legitimizes the idea that the public can do investigation, not just watch it. And that idea changes everything. Because once the audience believes it can solve the case, it stops being an audience. It becomes a jury, a court, a chorus, sometimes a mob.
It's easy to judge 1841 through modern eyes, but the truth is, law enforcement and public institutions in New York were still evolving into the structures we recognize today. Within a few years, New York would formalize its municipal police structure, moving away from older watch systems and toward a more professionalized force. And whether or not Mary Rogers' case directly caused that shift, cases like hers did something powerful. They put the limits of the system on display in public, day after day, headline after headline. Unsolved cases create pressure. Pressure creates performance. Performance creates mistakes. And then the public learns another habit. When the system can't deliver certainty, people start manufacturing it. This is one reason Mary Rogers matters to how people view true crime. Because the genre isn't only about crime, it's about institutions, about trust, failure, and the hunger for an ending. The audience doesn't want a list of facts, it wants the final scene. And when the final scene doesn't exist, the genre becomes a factory that produces substitute endings out of conjecture. Noir understands this. Noir is built on it.
Now, pull the camera back. If you swap the technology, newspapers for phones, pamphlets for podcasts, street gossip for comment threads, what changes? Not much. A familiar young woman becomes a public figure. She disappears. The story spreads faster than certainty. The audience argues theories like they're choosing sides, and the victim's life gets mined for meaning until it's barely recognizable. That's Mary Rogers. That's now. And here's the most uncomfortable part. Unsolved cases are endlessly reusable. They can be revived, reframed, re-edited, and re-monetized because there's no definitive ending to stop the machine. That's not just a media problem. That's a human problem. Because human beings hate uncertainty. We would rather have a wrong answer than no answer. Because no answer feels like the world has no rules. And a world with no rules is scarier than a villain. So the public keeps returning to Mary Rogers. Not because the public is cruel, though sometimes it is, but because the story offers something seductive. A sense that if we stare long enough, we can see through the fog.
Mary Rogers died in 1841. The case became famous. Her fiancé died months later near the same Hoboken landmark, and the story traveled through newspapers, through whispers, through literature, until it became a template for obsession. The details will always be debated because the record is tangled, and the tangle is part of the legacy. Because what the Mary Rogers case truly changed wasn't just one city's mood. It helped build a cultural pattern, that a murder can be consumed like a story, that speculation can be treated like participation, that attention can be mistaken for justice. And it taught the press and the public a hard truth. A mystery doesn't have to be solved to be profitable.
Mary Rogers didn't volunteer to become a symbol. She became one because the public learned it could turn a life into a headline, and a headline into a habit. True crime can be a search for understanding. It can be a demand for accountability.
It can even be a form of remembrance. But it can also be something else. Consumption. So if we're going to tell this story, if we're going to look back through the fog of 1841 and call it history, we should leave room for the simplest truth. Mary was a person before she was a case. And she mattered before she became content. New York City, 1841. Gaslight in the mist. A river that doesn't explain itself, and a public that discovered it liked the feeling of watching. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, give the video a like and subscribe for more noir true crime videos.